Dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I simply have to express my gratitude that I can be here and share some of my humble thoughts about a pressing problem which Gazela has termed as capitalism and democracy. What kind of relation do both systems have? Gerard opened his lecture by a normative and epistemological confession. He looks at matters through a Marxist prisma. I was sitting here in the first row and desperately thinking about where are my normative anchoring, which are the assumptions I have when I look to social, political, and economic matters. And probably I lost this Marxist view somewhere after I finished my studies at university. Then I was thinking, could it be Rawls' theory of justice? Then I thought it is too liberal for this surrounding here, and he probably believes too much in the trickle-down effects of neoclassical, in the sense of neoclassical economics. Then I thought, what would be better? I ended up with Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen and his theory of individual capabilities and an equality of life chances. But I'm not sure whether this is a real theory. And so I will start more modest. I will start even in a very typical German sense, and I have to apologize for that. I'm starting with concepts. I want to clarify concepts, and it is German because it relies to some extent on Max Weber. A second preliminary remark. I believe that capitalism can coexist with quite different political regimes. But democracy needs capitalism. This seems to be a certain tension, and of course we have to ask which sort of capitalism. This is a cognitive map which should lead me and which should orient you through my talk. I will briefly talk about what I understand under democracy. Then I will hint at the fact that there is a variety of capitalism. And then I want to juxtapose the logic, the inner logic of the two systems, the economic and the political one, and then asking the title question, are both systems in their inner working compatible with each other? I will be very brief on the challenges posed by financial capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, because at this point there is a high agreement with which or what Gerard has presented here. I even, and this is when I was looking at the charts, I even had one or two charts which are quite similar to those of Gerard, and obviously we cannot talk in these times about capitalism without using this wonderful charts of Thomas Piketty. So what is democracy? I have neither a Schumpeterian minimalist view of democracy nor a maximalist concept of democracy which integrates outcomes, outputs and outcomes, results of the decision-making within the political system. And here especially results which affects equality and social justice. So I have, or at least I start with a mid-range concept which is constituted here of 5 partial regimes, and they are interlinked, they are interdependent, but to some extent they have their own autonomy. And of course, the Schumpeterian definition is here in the middle. There must be a regime of general fair elections. Even we sometimes do not know what fair elections are. But in order to make democratic elections democratically meaningful, they have to be embedded. Here I use a term which is also used in the work of Karl Polanyi. When he talks about capitalism, he talks about embedding capitalism. And here, these electoral regimes have to be embedded by four other regimes. The one, it's clear, political rights. The other one, civil rights, because here I'm Habermasian. If you want to use political rights, then there must be a guarantee of individual civil rights. Otherwise, you cannot take full use of the political rights. This is what we see in many of the new democracies which have emerged in the last quarter of the 20th century. And here, horizontal accountability, this is checks and balances. This is especially the relation between parliaments, executives, and judiciary. And here I have a fifth one, which I think it's quite an important one, and we should reflect somehow more on that. And this is linked to the question of capitalism and democracy. Are those institutions, those elites, which are elected by democratic elections, indeed those who can make the decisive decision for the development of society? And here in the corners I have four major challenges. Therefore, just a recourse to this little debate on crisis, at least if it comes to political regimes, I prefer to talk about challenges. Because this is even less defined, certainly less defined than in economics, what we mean by crisis of democracy, and if we mean there was somewhere a golden age of democracy. I think this is empirically pure nonsense. Even I appreciate some of the works of Colin Crouch and post-democracy, but if you think about the role of women in the 1960s and early 70s, so to say the world, the golden age of democracy, certainly the situation of women, even it is not on equal footing in many respects, it's so much better than it was in the 60s, 70s. If you think about ethnic religious minorities, if you think about Afro-Americans, which have been called in the United States at the beginning of the 1960s quite often as niggers, and they didn't have the right to vote in 6 states. How can we talk about a golden age of democracy? But there is an aspect I want to come back where certainly the economy was differently organized and probably better compatible with democracy. So I see four major challenges, and at least 3 are triggered by the capitalist development, namely what we already heard, socioeconomic inequality, and this transforms. And this is a problem for democracy. It transforms in political inequality, and quite strictly. Globalization we heard about, and I also would call the Europeanization, the European Union, quite a problem posing to national democracies. I consider the European Union not a protection against deregulated markets. It was to some extent a Trojan horse for preparing and pushing through the deregulating of markets by the primary law of the working of the European Union, and this is free competition. The European Court of Justice plays quite an important role, which cannot be covered by any democratic theory. Capitalism. If we read, so again, I'm inspired what Gerard said, if we read the simple writing, probably the most simple writing of Marx in the Communist Manifest, you will immediately see how well he forecasted the globalization of capitalism. And what we see now is what I mean by triumph of capitalism, that the communist world, to a large extent, China, of course, leading, are now capitalist countries. So a specific mode of economic dealing with economic matters spread out over the globe. I very briefly would distinguish between at least 4 types of capitalism. There may be more. The coordinated welfare capitalism we have seen in the 60s and 1970s, especially until 79 when Margaret Thatcher, and 1980 when Ronald Reagan took over the power in the Anglo-Saxon world. And then what we have heard, the neoliberal capitalism, Polanyi would call it disembedded. Disembedded means capitalism freed itself, or better. By democratic decision, capitalism was able to get rid of social regulations and political regulation. To a large extent, however, there are differences, certainly between the United States and Denmark, Finland, and France on the other hand. But there is a new form, a strange mix of state capitalism with characteristic of a Manchester capitalism Friedrich Engels has once described. And this state capitalism obviously can coexist very well with authoritarian regime, as China shows. And if you look to Korea and the development of Korea, it is exactly the same story, or Taiwan, where capitalism had its most dynamic trigger at the end of authoritarian regimes, and to some extent triggered a change of political regimes. So capitalism can only be a trigger for changing authoritarian regimes. China will be certainly one of the most important examples we have to look at. And then, as what you know, this kind of oligarchic capitalism, which we have in authoritarian, or I would call them hybrid regimes like the Ukraine and Russia, where you had an original accumulation of capital, which can be called gangster capitalism. And Marx wrote, as far as I remember, Marx wrote about the crimes, the incredible crimes of the original capitalism. And this you can see very nicely, or not so nicely, in the 2 countries. The logics. I argue there are different logics which determine the working of capitalism and democracy, which hold both systems in a constant tension, situation of tensions. Capitalism is based on property, on private property, and to a large extent also, as at least neoclassical economists are not getting tired to tell us, on inequality, because a certain degree of inequality triggers economic activities. This is one of the basic ideologies, or one of the basic characteristics of capitalism. Democracy is, at least on normative grounds, is based on equal civic and political rights. So here equality, not inequality, matters. Capitalism is based on individual profit. It needs individual profit. Democracy is claiming to strive for the common good. Capitalism very much, and even under managerial forms of capitalism, is based on unilateral decision-making, while democracy is based on discourse, debate, and some kind of majoritarian decision-making. In some democracies, more consensual, and more majoritarian. By the way, I'm very much more in favor of consensual democracies than the classical 50.1% majoritarian democracy. So power is constituted through property, private property in capitalism, and power in democracies comes through general elections. But there are also some convergencies, some similarities in the logic. Both systems need a kind of rule of law. Democracy is certainly a well-developed rule of law, and capitalism, at least a form of legal state which assures the investors that their investments are safe in the next year as well. There's competition, and both systems need competition. Therefore, and here I may agree, this is for capitalism not an unproblematic development that we have we increasingly get an oligopolistic or monopolistic structure in some sectors of the economy. And both systems need constraints, and this is quite important. Otherwise, the systems are degenerating or taking over the other system. So I would say both systems are necessary because they mutually check the accumulation of power. However, I would claim under democratic auspices, there is a higher normative claim for democratic self-government. This is normatively higher to judge than, for example, economic efficiency. And here I see a problem for the future development of democracy, certainly, that obviously citizens are no longer that much interested in the input dimension and participation of democracy. They are sometimes satisfied with the outcomes. If the outcomes are working well, then democracy may be fine. And by the way, again, to the crisis matter, if you're coming certainly not from the navel of the world, however, if you would ask people in Germany if there are a crisis of the economy, they would say no. Never better during the last 20 years. And even despite this scandalous crisis of the financial sectors, which was to some extent overcome by tax money, certainly completely unjust, but it shows you the power of capitalism to overcome their crisis. This is certainly a mode of living, a mode of existence, a mode of survival of capitalism to have crisis. And I think this more as an adaptation to new circumstances than to what we used in the more mechanistic interpretation of Marxism, leading to a Kladderadatsch, to a final crisis of capitalism. I'm very brief, and I don't run through all these factors. We have heard something. There may not have been, or there certainly was not a classical golden age of democracy, but there was a kind of golden age of coexistence between capitalism and democracy, and this is somewhere in the 1950s, 60s to the mid-70s, mostly developed and strongly developed in the Scandinavian country, not based on the nationalization of industry, but this is something very recent we have to think about again, about the control of the credit sector. Sweden, Denmark did have much less nationalized industry than compared to France and even Germany. So there was a Keynesian welfare state intervention into the business cycle, and there was a primary concern, and the primary concern was full employment. And it was enabled, what Walter Korpi and Gösta Esping Andersen have termed a balance of power between capital and labor. and organization matter. This is also a problem certainly the lower third or the lower 50% of the society have, that huge collective organizations are eroding. And I don't see signs in a more individualized society that these collective organizations like trade union or huge catch-all parties can be survived. We heard what Gerard said, this kind of precarious coexistence among equal partners did not last very long, and it broke at the end of the 1970s. And then we had what can be called financial capitalism or financialization of capitalism or neoliberal capitalism. And I don't have to go into detail. We heard about this in the first presentation, but I would bring forward and I would launch it into the discussion. This is what one can call the disembedding of capitalism, and the work of Karl Polanyi is something quite actual, what we have actually to look at these times. This is a very manipulative graph. Certainly, we have seen it differently. But if you look to the mid-80s, in almost all, or in all OECD countries, you had an increase of socioeconomic inequality. You have different indicators you can measure here. I used the Gini index, and you see there is an increase of this inequality. And here is a difference to Gerard. I believe capitalism can live very well with these inequalities, but democracy cannot. Because one of the diseases of democracies, established democracies today, is the complete dropping out of the lower third of society. We are living in a 2/3 democracy or 50% democracy. The lower third of the society does not participate anymore. And all these nice NGOs, social movements, we like so much, they are even more socially selective. They are recruiting those young people who are well educated. So this is what I would call a middle-class oligarchization of our democracies, very much triggered by the increasing inequality of our societies. Here you have poverty rates. One of the richest countries in the world, the United States, has one of the highest poverty rates among OECD countries, if not the highest. And you see the European countries are quite lower. This hints at the fact we have different types of capitalism with different impacts on society. Therefore, we should get more used to talk about capitalism in a form of plural, in the form of varieties of capitalism. But even in these nice European, continental, North European countries, there is an increase of poverty throughout the last decades. And this is what I don't show you. This is, again, one of the Piketty transparency everybody can find through Google. And this is from 2003. This is like a bathtub, and we are back. And this is a basic message. Whatever we take, 10%, 1%, or 0.1%, we are back in the situation right after the First World War. And this is certainly something we have to take care of. This is the famous 0.1% we have seen. What can we conclude from that? There are unresolved challenges of democracy which do not put democracy outright in danger or in a crisis, but I fear much more there is a hollowing out. On hollowing out, the democratic institutions are working. However, the substance is of democracy is decreasing. We have, throughout all countries, a declining of voter turnout. This wouldn't be such a problem in most of the European countries. In my country, you still have 70% of voter turnout. In Scandinavia, sometimes above 80%. By the way, in brackets, I'm very much in favor of mandatory voting, which would at least be something against this increasing social selectivity. But each percent lower voter turnout means 0.8% the lower strata are dropping out. The middle classes are well off. They are organized. They are, if they are young, as I have told you, they are in NGOs. And if they are not young, they are sitting in parliaments and in political parties. So, however, unfortunately, I'm rather skeptical about most of the remedies, the cures we are discussing these days. One is direct democracy, referenda. If you have an empirical look at them, they are even more socially selective. They are much lower turnouts, and the lower strata are not at all present. There is as one Swiss colleague has written, a self-exclusion of the incompetent. And by the way, there's also a gender asymmetry, which we don't have anymore in elections, but in referenda, many more men are going to referenda than women. The globalization or the neoliberal globalization or the financialization of capitalism made the state more vulnerable. This is what we see by the big monopolistic enterprises. They simply blackmail states, and they blackmail one of their core they blackmail one of their core competencies, meaning their ability to extract on a just matter taxes from society. Google is sitting in one of the free riding countries in Europe, Ireland, because they don't have to pay taxes. And we have this kind of tax haven, which, by the way, the European Union was not able or not willing to close. It even had to struggle for such a long time in order to close one of the most illegal or problematic tax havens in this important state of Luxembourg. And what we heard from our chancellor, which plays a highly dubious role in the crisis of the euro, she is pledging and pressing the parliament constantly and arguing we need a market conformist democracy. So markets becomes a sovereign, not the people. Of course, from a democratic point of view, we have to argue we need markets which are which have to be conformist with democracy, and not democracies which have to conform to the logic of the markets. Just a few which shows you in one decade we just did a correlation between the status, the quality of democracy measured by 100 indicators, and social justice measured as well by some sort of 20 indicators. And you have a clear positive correlation. The more social just, in some extent, equal a society is, the better democracy is. One of the problems and mysteries, if it is true, and I agree here on Gerard's presentation, if the 99% are not the winners of the economic development during the last decades, then we have to ask, why do they not vote for those parties who are against the 1%? Why do they not vote for parties which want to overcome the inequality? There are certain points I don't go into detail which explain it. competition for the median voter, I would say the failure of social democracy in a certain period of time, the third way period, which left many people in a disillusioned state. However, new parties are not a way out. All these nice new parties, ecological left socialist parties, and even the nasty right-wing populist party, they are not organizing the lower strata, not at all. I come, otherwise I get problems from my right side. I'm glad to be on the left side for the moment here, and I come to the conclusion, the last slide. I would argue embedded capitalism, despite all tensions, embedded capitalism is compatible with democracy, and a more centralized economy would certainly not a solution. Probably nobody here in the room would propagate that one. I don't think to think about what we heard in the 1970s, despite against all the estimation I have to this writing, Habermas, Klaus Offe, Jim O'Connor at the beginning of the 1970s, they were talking about late capitalism. How long are we talking about late capitalism? Late capitalism logically suggests that there should be something beyond capitalism, and I have my serious doubts. Very interesting if you go back for a moment and read what the Trilateral Commission has scripted in the mid-1970s, Sam Huntington, Watanuki, and Crozier for the Trilateral Commission. They, in a way, prescribed the lean state, and the lean state and a small government would escape all the problems of an overloaded government. And what happened was indeed a lean government. And here I agree, certainly the financial crisis of capitalism has showed that all of a sudden government are overburdened because they were following the lean state democracy, because they had to take over the debts, and they did take over the debts of the banks. I leave it with that, and I leave it to the discussion we have in these days. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Merkel. This was really interesting to listen, especially some aspects which you mentioned about gender position, which I'm sure that some women here took up. But I would like now to open the floor for the questions. Yes?
Mentioning disintegrated or neoliberal capitalism in UK and US, you said that it was done by a democratic decision. The decision to adopt neoliberal policies were democratic. But in this case, you have to explain why the golden age of compatibility between democracy and liberalism ends with a democratic decision to put an end to this coexistence and to the golden age. Or another alternative is that neoliberal policy wasn't adopted by a democratic decision, at least in the UK and US.
The paradox is that you are forcing me to use a term which I have criticized, the ubiquitous usage of the term, meaning crisis. There was, in the 1970s, stagflation. Oh, I found a term which prevents me from using crisis. There was stagflation, meaning extreme low economic growth on the one side and high inflation. So the economic recipes of John Maynard Keynes did not work anymore in this time. And then there was a thinking and rethinking of doing post-war economies, meaning should we not leave the Keynesian paradigm? And in economic science, among economists, the Keynesianism has already lost his dominant position against monetarism and a kind of Hayekian fiscal conservatism. So it was, so to say, pre-running what has been done by Margaret Thatcher in the beginning with heavy fights against the trade unions, and by Ronald Reagan. And if Anglo-Saxon capitalism, so to say, deregulates in order to trigger more economic dynamics, the other countries have to react in a world where we are living in globalized economic structures. And they did. And even this wonderful, nice, cozy Scandinavian countries changed something all OECD countries did. They changed their tax system. And this is one of the problems, certainly, we have, changing the tax system, meaning lowering business and corporate taxes, lowering taxes for capital income, lowering taxes for high income, means there is a path. Douglas North remembered us. If we are embarking on policy paths, it's extremely difficult to leave such a path. This is path dependency, what we are discussing here. And then there was the crowning in 1990 by the Washington Consensus, where more or less all these OECD countries accepted this way. So it was not some technological drivers, not anonymous markets. At the beginning were political decisions. However, I have not sufficient fantasy to think about how this process can be reversed in a more regulated forms of especially financial market. This is what we heard after 2008. And if you look at what happened, it did not happen very much. So it was now the term, it was a crisis, stagflation crisis in the 1970s, which triggered this term in economic policy making, advanced especially by Anglo-Saxon capitalism.
Two basic logics that you seem to be comparing, capitalism and democracy, whereas here, capitalism is a system, democracy is form of regimes. So I would have understood if you had compared, for instance, democracy, authoritarianism, fascism, taking some of the objective criteria, for instance, in terms of appropriation, you could see different levels or different degrees of differences between democracy, authoritarianism, and fascism. But here you are just trying to examine that logic in system and regime. I see a problem there, don't you see? And in your conclusion, you seem to be just saying, okay, embedded democracy, and the conclusion is balance of class power. You might create that balance of class power in authoritarian regimes, even in fascism. So that's the major problem of that modernization theory that is reproducing itself through Habermasian approach. That's the principle I have in mind.
Shiraz said this is probably another lecture. I could repeat it, and I certainly cannot respond sufficiently to your very good question. I don't see such a problems even from a Weberian point of view comparing a system with a regime. I would even, you can conceptualize both entities, capitalism and democracy, either as a regime, meaning as a ruling order, or from a more functionalist point of view as a system. And here I would even turn it around. What you said, I would argue capitalism is not a real system. It's more an order of doing economic business. Whereas democracy can be easily conceptualized and has been conceptualized by David Easton as a system. You have input factors, demands, and supports from the society. You have throughput factors, institutions, organizations which proceed these demands and transform them in decision. This is the output, and the output feeds back into the input, meaning if the people are satisfied with the output, they will increase the support for the system. And this is how you can understand from a functionalist point of view democracy, and I don't see it in the same way with capitalism. I would then certainly, it's a good hint, make it clearer that I conceptualize it as two regimes, and this means a ruling order of the political and economic matters. Balance of power in authoritarian regime, I don't believe it. Which kind? If you have a non-controlled political regime by the people, they have the last say in political and economic matters. And if you look to the present capitalist forms in China, despite you have each day quite significant rebellions in terms of, for example, what is it, the Mac computers, what is?
Apple.
Apple, thank you very much. In Apple firms and other huge conglomerates, you have each day not only strikes, you have real violent clashes. This does not lead to any balance of power. And here, collective organization is one of the key things we have to think about. Collective organization is power. If you are not at the command heights of the economy, you have to have a medium which you contraposes against this private property accumulation, and this is organization. But in times where you cannot create these huge, powerful collective organizations, not at least, and here one can argue with Marx, if the workforce is no longer that homogeneous, then you will not organize this workforce anymore, not in the service sectors. And in countries like Great Britain, only 10% of the employment force is now in the industrial sector. And I don't see this changing. By the way, if I leave the economic sector and I go to the political regimes, I also see that social movements are too euphemistic. The Occupy movement was probably the first real, more virtual, digital movement and not a real movement. And this was also one reason why it was not fulfilling these wonderful hopes we had at the beginning. And I don't want to talk about fascism in its different varieties. I don't believe that in authoritarian regimes you can create a balance of power. It has even become now very difficult in democratic regimes. One sentence which is quite interesting. If you have an historical perspective, there's a wonderful book by Adam Przeworski, Some Sort of Rational Choice Marxist, strange combination. And Adam Przeworski, the book is called Paper Stones. And with paper stones, he means the right to vote. And the right to vote led throughout the 20th century to especially in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, to a redistribution of income and wealth, to the creation of a welfare state, to creation of some sort of social protection. But these paper stones obviously do not work in the same way in the 21st century, and we have not invented the institutions and the organization which can substitute an instrument which obviously lost the grip on political power.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, and Professor Mochnik wanted to ask one question. So I will just allow this one more question, and I will invite you all for further discussion in Friday afternoon. We are having a workshop with Professor Merkel at Goethe Institute where we are continuing this discussion. So please, Professor Mochnik, just...
Thank you. Thank you for the last question. I have a follow-up to colleagues' question. Namely, you charted the logic of capitalism and the logic of democracy, and those logics are either divergent or contradictory. But there is one common point, and that is a tendency towards oligarchy. So I find it ironic to the general intention of your speech. On the other hand, I would suggest that we don't look at democracy as a system, but as an achievement. And all the democratic inventions of the 20th century were actually achievements of movements of revolt or resistance, starting with the movement, the struggle for women's vote. And then Soviets in October Revolution, and then national liberation councils in Yugoslav anti-fascist struggle, and so on and so on, up to the plenums of the students' occupations. And I think it would be more productive to look at democracy as an achievement of certain political movements who invent their own forms of democracy, be they ephemeral or not.
There are certainly different forms of looking at democracy. If we look at it as an achievement, we don't have a real concept. We don't really know how these institutions, organizations are linked to each other. This is the giving up of a more systemic view. No doubt about it, and I would agree. We can look at democracy as an achievement coming out of struggles. Here I'm completely following you, but this is not a concept about the working of democracy. It is a concept of the emergence of certain democratic rights. And then if we look at that, we may not have a good set of indicators in order to observe the development of democracy. I completely agree that movements played an important role. From the worker movement, which was probably the most powerful in the 20th century, and certainly to the women's movement starting already at the beginning of the 20th century as well. These movements became especially politically powerful at the moment where they left the status as a movement. To talk about the workers' movement in the 20th century, meaning talking about especially two forms of organization. Left parties, socialist, communist, social democratic parties, and trade unions. These are not in a classical sense movements. So this is a kind of paradoxon, where obviously the representative institution of democracy are so powerful to transform these social movements in order to become those organizations which have the right to enter parliament, and parliament is the arena for political decision making. And this is something worthwhile. While I'm reading, while I'm talking, I'm thinking about that. This is certainly something worthwhile to look in it. What does it mean that democracy has this transformative power? Does it moderate? Does it tame these oppositional movement? And here we have, I would say, here we have to do more work than being simply emphatic about new social movements. We are looking desperately here in the 21st century. There are movements, but except Occupy, most of these movements, ecological movements, movement for women's rights, movement for gay rights and so forth, is very much identity politics and not redistributional politics. And here I would criticize social democratic parties that they left at a certain moment this redistributional problem in terms of identity politics, and progressivity today very often means this kind of progressive identity politics.
Thank you very much for the answers and the question, which were very interesting.
Very important, sorry. Sorry to touch you first and sorry to interrupt you. The oligarchic structure and convergence, this is a very powerful image. This is where I would follow you immediately. However, these are different sorts of oligarchy, and we have to look at this as well.